fourth public meeting of the Baltimore Regional Water Task Force, the second meeting here in Baltimore City. I'm Baltimore City Comptroller Bill Henry, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force. We are joined here tonight by 11 other members in person and one member who is participating electronically through the wonders of the internet. Are we? Oh, I'm sorry. We're still down one member, but hopefully we will be joined shortly. Tonight we'll be focusing on our final fiscal analysis, and we're going to go through the agenda really quickly. As with previous meetings, we're going to take the first couple of minutes to recap and follow up from meeting 3. I will ask task force members to please be judicious in asking questions about the follow-up so that we can make sure that we get into the actual fiscal analysis for today. I want to thank Mount Pleasant for hosting us, and in the interest of safety, point out that there are emergency exits. Well, for the audience, they're behind you and to that side. And for us, I would think it would still be a good idea to go out those same exit doors that we came in. The public can sign up for the opportunity to provide comment during that portion of the meeting. You can sign up at any time during the meeting or during the break between task force discussion and public comments. And you can also provide questions, comments, and testimony by email to the committee at watergovernance@baltimorecity.gov. If there is a question tonight that we don't have either time to answer or more likely the immediate answer to off the top of our heads, we will follow up on email and post it to our website, which is very long and complicated, and you might be better off Googling Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force. The sign-up is at the table over by the doors where you came in. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed on Baltimore County's Facebook site. It will also be posted on YouTube in the next day or so. There are multiple opportunities to engage with the task force after tonight's meeting. And lastly, just a reminder both to the public and to the task force, we still have a lot of work to do before we can make recommendations, and that will require a significant discussion of the fiscal analysis materials that WSP has provided us and that we will review today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our committee staff to proceed with their presentation, and I look forward to all of us getting some good work done tonight. Thank you.
Chair Henry, thank you. I'm Neil Callahan with WSP, and I'd like to just kind of introduce the schedule for the next virtual task force meeting. So we are at the 4th meeting where, as you said, we're going to deal with the final fiscal analysis. And the 5th meeting is kind of summarizing where we are and the recommendation for consideration at the virtual meeting. We are going to kind of move into recap, and I'm going to move pretty quickly if we can because we've got a lot of content tonight. And the task force charge, as you're well aware at this point, is to review the governance and the findings in the New Gen report. And I strongly caution you because we're going to pivot very hard from financial work to performance and issues that are in the task force charter from the legislature to look at. So fiscal is part of it, but performance is also part of it. So we need to make sure we cover that. And there's quite a bit of material that's in there. In the next slide, this is what is in there. These are the 8 categories that looked at for what may be improved in each of the governance models. The next slide is the framework has to address how the governance will change or be modified, what financing would be changed or modified, and so on for each of these categories. And we've talked about some of these already, but we're going to continue to expand as we move through that. And the last slide is still on what's in the recommended governance model, is what are kind of the fiscal implications associated with the system transitions and stakeholders and other items that will be addressed. So we're working pretty diligently to try to package that for the next meeting. The next thing we've done is kind of summarize what we've gone through from workshops 2 through tonight. We kind of looked at the various governance models or relationships and reduced to CD&E, the consideration of the task force at your discretion. We started with kind of the as-is financial status, what kind of is the existing conditions. And tonight we're going to look at the fiscal analysis on terms of more comparative terms. So that's the thrust of the content for tonight. So we also have kind of just grouped for more for identification and anything, some of the follow-up questions into some categories. So you'll see these icons just in the slides to identify kind of what area the questions addressed. And I'm going to move to the first series of questions. The first questions that came out of the last meeting were, what are the historical experiences of other cities moving to a special district? What are some of the examples of the utilities that transition into them? And what are some of the shortlisted utilities that are being interviewed further? And to answer, at least in part, some of these, we're actually going to give you the 2 case studies. So we've done some interviews with 2 authorities. One is Tampa Bay Water, where they were collaborative, and they transitioned to a regional authority. They had some environmental issues that drove them. The regulators were compelling them to make changes. They had different cost structures between each of the members. The legislators' role in that case was simply to threaten to step in and fix it if they didn't. And so they established a number of work groups, spent 24 months. And here are some of the kind of key issues. The duration was 24 months from the time that they started till the time they were able to actually get the charter approved by all of the political subdivisions that were necessary. There was 108 political people had to vote to do this. The governance changed from 5 board members in the prior organization to 9, which included all of the members, and the pocket votes, vetoes went away. All the votes became binding. Some other kind of interesting aspects for them is they did not pay a great deal of money to anyone outside. They had 6 members and their board, and they used the resources of those members and board to arrive at, negotiate the settlement that became, or the charter that became the new organization. A couple of outcomes: they obviously became the exclusive supplier. They are a wholesaler, so they only sell wholesale volumes of water of a particular quality. One of the big issues that they had to contend with is coming to a uniform rate. So this is 3 counties, 3 cities spread out quite a bit with demographics all over the map. And so coming to the notion that everybody would pay a uniform rate for a fixed volume of water was quite a lift. They did have to refinance all of the assets that they had purchased from their members. So they purchased the water supply assets. So they took out, I think we heard today, $370 million in bonds as a new agency, kind of right out of the chute, and paid off some of the asset costs to the members. And in this instance, one thing that's very different is it didn't involve significant pensions. because it wasn't merging of two entities. It was a single entity transforming to a regional entity with a different rate structure and governance. So the next,
before you go on, we have a question about the Tampa Bay situation, and also I'm realizing I have one more announcement for the task force members, which is that in this particular seating configuration, I cannot easily see most of you. So if you have a question, you're going to have to just pull your microphone up and get my attention that way by please address the chair, and I'll cut off the speaker to recognize you. And now, Senator McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Neil, thank you as always for the detailed report. As one of the two state representatives, and as you're going through the Tampa Bay example, can you just let us know if the state had a role within this transition or if not?
Well, the regulatory agencies are, a state entity. So they had a role because they were the driving force to make changes. There were litigation in place, but the legislature's role was simply to tell Tampa Bay Water, their members, stop the suits, get on with your business. If you don't, we will step in and fix it for you. So that was their role. They had no, since there was no funding issue, there was no need for them to get involved in that place. But they considered it a very serious threat that Tallahassee would step in and take over, what they were doing. So they took it very seriously. But there was no direct role in this case. And if I can continue on, the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is the water authority that is now managing the Detroit water and sewer assets, the larger assets, the treatment plants, water supply, and treatment in Detroit and for southern Michigan. Its formation started with the bankruptcy of the Detroit system. So as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, the suburban counties got kind of tagged, and they originally entered into an MOU between the Detroit Water and Sewer and Great Lakes Water Authority. Again, kind of an intense statement saying we will join to become a regional water authority. That was 2014. And in 2016, again, 2 years later, they charted and started the new authority. Their board of directors is as indicated, with representatives from the multiple counties, the state of Michigan, and the city of Detroit. So they dispersed kind of the governance responsibilities in their board. Of interest, that was the 40-year lease for the Detroit water and sewer assets. So the major assets were leased, or under a facility use agreement is actually the term, but it is essentially a lease over 40 years. That lease has a direct cost or payment of $50 million a year over that term, paid to the city of Detroit to pay for, and it is limited to pay for, water and sewer repairs in the city of Detroit. There is also, or has been, another roughly $50 million a year payment made to the city. And we understood today, or actually got clarified a little bit today, that was paid towards some of the pension fund issues associated with paying off or paying through the city pension. And there is a designated percentage of revenues that goes to fund payment for affordability and equity programs in the city and in the county. So it's available to their customers. They did assume $4 billion of debt in effect. It is not that the debt transferred, I don't believe. It's just that they took the obligation to pay for it through their revenues. And I want to start kind of making some distinctions. We've talked about this is a wholesale authority as well. So they have the big assets, the big pipes, the treatment plants. The city retained its retail system. So it still has a Department of Public Works. It still does local repairs of local mains. It still sets local rates. And that's with the same with all of the members of Great Lakes Water. So I'm going to talk tonight, and I'll use kind of the shorthand for all of the situations of kind of wholesale scale utility and retail scale utility, the local pipes and sewers. In definitionally in your agreements, you have joint use facilities on the wastewater side, and you have treatment, conveyance, and distribution greater than 12 inches. So those are what I'm going to refer to as kind of the wholesale scale things as we move forward. It's just a shorthand, but it's too long to keep repeating that over and over. So that's my glossary terms for tonight. The lease agreement is lengthy and contentious. That's the best I've heard it described. And just checking them on the slides. Some of the scale, their treatment plant, they do have combined sewers. It is a large treatment plant. By comparison, it treats, not its design, but it treats 650 million gallons a day. The combined capacity of the city and county is something in the order of about 200 million gallons a day. So a bigger facility, and they serve a lot of people. They have the obligations moving forward to manage the wholesale assets. So they're kind of solely in charge, and they use a model contract for each of their members. This is a graphic slide that kind of talks about how they organize their transitions. They did use a program management office. They did use 3 retained outside consultants. They did use a lot of people that were available from the city of Detroit and people that were kind of designated Great Lakes Water Authority. There were probably significant expenses. We have had some initial discussions. One of the key factors we do not have is how much this cost. They said they would get us that figure, but it wasn't readily available. However, in one of the things that is a fact that we do know is the legislature gave them a grant of $3.8 million to fund some of those transition activities. So we're going to get back to you with what we think the transition costs, and this will come up again as we move forward. But this is their kind of organizational approach, work groups for finance and accounting, operational issues. You have some advantage that certainly your wholesale stuff is already defined. So there's a starting framework, which they didn't have. And I'm going to turn it over to Art.
Before you turn it over to Art, I had a clarification from I guess it's the slide 17, where we're discussing some of the details in the transition to authority from Great Lakes.
Yep.
The second bullet, the authority pays Detroit $50 million a year lease payment. Sounds good if you just stop reading there, but then it says for capital improvement for Detroit's retail water system and to repair Detroit's retail aging water infrastructure. So I'm taking it that Detroit Water and Sewer is still responsible for some significant portion of the infrastructure inside the city of Detroit.
Yeah, that's the distinction where I said that the Detroit Water and Sewer still exists.
Yeah.
And they have all the responsibilities for the retail kind of end of their business. So that $50 million can go to help them make repairs and do things, but it's still the city of Detroit's obligations to manage, fund, repair them.
I guess I'm just sort of questioning whether that's a poor labeling to call that a lease payment, because that kind of that implies that that you're paying Detroit money for renting the rest of the system. And when I'm told I receive a lease payment, I expect I can use that money any way I want. But what they're really saying is they're outsourcing the capital the capital cost and the maintenance of the parts of the system that they did not take over to Detroit Water and Sewer, and this is how much they're giving every year to make that capital work doable.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. You know, understanding that the context of this is settling a bankruptcy.
Yeah,
So,
I say that because I'm regretting now not saying something at our last meeting about how we may want to be very, very, very careful about considering this to be a worthwhile model for us to consider, because we are not in the same situation Detroit was in. This is not a bankruptcy situation. And I think we need to be very careful about just taking this as one more way we could do things, when this is closer to a list of cautionary tales of things you don't want to be in the position of, and you shouldn't be if your water and sewer system isn't in bankruptcy. So I just want to make it clear, we're not in a situation where the surrounding counties are worried about bailing out the city or not.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, that is the language they had. That was their concerns. You know, I want to probably even be more clear with what the intent of that language about going to the sewer system was. Is they wanted to be exceptionally clear that that funding couldn't go to the general fund of the city. It had to stay in water and sewer. That is explicitly what it says.
Dr. Mitchell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question. How this transition, how did it impact Detroit and this region's rates? Did in order to fund these capital projects and some pension struggles, did the rates change? Did they go up? Did they go down? What happens with rates for this region?
I don't have that answer, to be perfectly honest. So we'll have to follow up and try to see, I mean, what rates they've had historically are published. So we just didn't pull that together our focus, I guess, was on the transition itself. What I can just tell you is in the discussion we had with their CEO, they said, you know, they are a regional utility and they do customer service, and they are getting extremely high satisfaction scores. So that, you know, isn't a statement about rates, but is a statement that there is a good deal of satisfaction with the outcomes.
Senator McCray and then Ms. Buckler.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Neil, if you could speak to the board makeup. So when you look at the board makeup for the two examples that you gave, could you inform us of how many years did a person serve maybe as a term? Were there consecutive terms before a person had to be removed, whether they served their duties, and like who chaired the respective boards that was made up?
Again, I don't have that level of detail. We do have a call again scheduled with the CEO. We can certainly get that information. So, but again, we're kind of looking at gross transition issues, not, but do get your point. That's an important point.
And when you call a question, could you also just get an understanding of like which positions was de facto? So if in some of these jurisdictions, did the DPW director serve by default because they serve in that position from that standpoint? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I've seen some of the current people that are in that. I think they're more public representatives, but I'll check in any event.
Ms. Buckler and then Mr. Moran.
Yeah. So I do want to make some comments from Baltimore County side on this. Although we are not in a bankrupt situation like Detroit was, there's obviously concerns from the surrounding jurisdictions. That's why we're sitting here. That's why Baltimore County is a partner on this task force. You can easily Google all the issues that have come up in the past year, 2 years related to the water and wastewater system and the response from Baltimore County, and that we are trying to be a partner. And right now, the way that the relationship is structured, we're not an even partner. We don't have an even voice in what happens, when it happens, how it happens to the citizens in Baltimore County. And the citizens in Baltimore County are more than half of the participants in this system at this point. So when there's issues, major issues, environmental issues, health issues in this system, we don't have a say right now. So that's why we're sitting here. So it may not be bankruptcy, but it's similar in the fact that we're not having the say that we need to have in the system.
Actually, Ms. Buckler, that's kind of the point I was making, which is that the idea that the counties want to partner with the city and help make everything work better is really the other end of an axis from the counties are afraid of bailing out the city. That's like that. And that's why I was saying, I'm not sure that Detroit is a model to emulate as much as it's a series of cautionary tales. So I'm not saying it as if the Detroit example is an example that a regional authority is a bad idea. I'm saying the Detroit example is an example of how to do an authority poorly from the perspective of the city. Mr. Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Neil, on slide 17, it says here, the third bullet down, reportedly another $50 million a year paid towards pension costs and a fund to aid struggling customers. Reportedly.
Yeah. Again, we have sometimes we have some issues associated with the timing of when we publish and what information we have. We have been trying to reach the informed Great Lakes Water Authority personnel to get an explanation. We got it at 2:30 this afternoon, so it's more than reported. That's what they actually paid. In fact, she stated that was meant to pay off the pension obligations that resulted from the transition. It was meant for 10 years and it was paid off early. So it's not my caveated reported. When I find something on the internet, I have to be careful that it's not a fact. So until I validate it from somebody that I consider and can identify as you said this, you'll see I may use the term reported.
Okay, but as of now,
it's a fact.
You said it's a fact. Okay, and do you know any more about the pension obligations they paid out? Because I do know that a number of people in the city of Detroit, the employees of the city of Detroit, when the state government came in and took over the city of Detroit, a lot of pensioners and people that had receiving pensions were shortchanged, so to speak. Do you know if that was the case with the water authority of the city of Detroit? I mean, they saw their pension payments drastically reduced. And I just don't know what was the situation with the city of Detroit water and sewer department.
Nor do I. Again, I had a 5-minute conversation to check some facts.
Okay. So can you
and
follow up on that, please?
We have scheduled a call.
Thank you.
We will follow up on
Thank
that
you.
most definitely.
Were there any other questions? Okay.
I have one, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification, Neil, you mentioned something about a uniform rate with respect to, was that Tampa or was it Great Lakes?
I said the uniform rate, that's Tampa's term for their rate. So everybody, no matter where you are, no matter what your circumstances are, within a few limited parameters, that you're charged exactly the same rate. So they span 1,000 miles, 3 counties, and everybody in there at a wholesale basis gets the same wholesale rate. Now, every retail customer kind of has a different charge and different set of fees and different rate structures, just like you've experienced here. So they're, what customers bill, not necessarily the same, but the supply of water is at a uniform rate. There is a reference to, they use a model contract in GLWA. That's also one of the follow-up items that we'd like to understand. We think there is a basic framework for a uniform structure for a rate. It would not be the same in there, since we know there's factors in it that would vary the cost, but they seem to be practical. So we're trying to get more details on that.
Thank you.
I also want to take a moment to recognize that we've been joined by City Administrator Faith Leach, and to also take this opportunity to ask either Ms. Buckler or Delegate Stein that if we're joined by any high-ranking county officials, please let me know, because the literal job of recognizing dignitaries is harder if you don't actually recognize them. So, okay, thank you very much. Oh, Mr. Davis.
Neil, quick question for on slide 17. Is there a breakdown of the $4 billion in debt? Was that any consent decree items, or was that what was the? Maybe add that to the list.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a longer list now, but yeah, there's a lot of details we'd like to try to get. So yes, we'll follow up.
One more question for your list. Previously reported 50 million a year goes to two things. Can you ask them how that divides out?
The 50 that are mentioned to go to the pension and the
customers.
Yeah, we have some details on that. We just similarly, they're reported, so I'd rather not state them until I get them verified, but we will bring that back.
Okay, thank you.
I thought that was actually broken out at a previous meeting, that it was a $10 million fund for aiding residents, and that would leave the other 40 for pension contributions.
It's substantial. I just honestly don't recall how it worked out.
It's funny when you say it's substantial. It's like, well, that's substantial for the pension side. I remember thinking 10 million. I'm not sure if that's a whole lot of money for, if that's all of what's going toward supporting essentially an equity-based payment program. But yeah, we'll dig in on the details, and I think we're done interrupting you before you turn it over to Art.
Not quite.
Nope, apparently we're not.
Yeah, Yusuf has a question.
Oh, okay. Mr. Cabetta.
So Yusuf is asking if there is a significant variance in employee compensation between Detroit Water and Sewer staff and GLWA staff of equivalent positions.
Another excellent question. We'll try to weekend to follow up.
Yosef will join the line of people waiting for the answers to great questions. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Art Griffith, and I have some additional follow-ups from our previous task force meetings. All right, and here we are. So we had a question about state support, and the question was the level of state and federal support to Baltimore's city and Baltimore County's water and wastewater programs. And we had a conversation with the Maryland Department of Environment, MDE, and they gave us the outstanding state revolving fund loan principal balance. And you can see them on the slide, broken up into the city's water system, the city's sewer system, the county's water system, and the county's sewer system. This isn't the amount of the original amount of the loan. This is what's left to be repaid. Also, there are pending state revolving fund loans that are in the process of being approved. And the city also has a WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Financing Act, loan of about $350 million. Another question asked was about contacting the Maryland Economic Development Commission as a potential for a conduit financing or a financing arm related to the potential newly formed Water and Wastewater Authority, and we're still in the process of making contact with them and having those conversations. So when we do, we can report out. That's fine.
Actually,
Okay,
before you move on, we have a quick question about the first part. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to recognize that the question was deliberately asked about capital versus operating, but you gave one breakdown.
And so I haven't gone into the city and the county's accounting records to try to ferret out the operating assistance, but certainly tried to do over time.
This is all just capital.
This is all just capital. These are state revolving fund loans for capital.
I'm going to ask, do you get, I mean, most state financing for water and sewer relates, nearly exclusively to capital. So there is likely to be de minimis amounts of state support unless it's a particular grant of some kind. But even then,
Neil, I'm with you 100%. I'm just a little surprised that it's hard for the city and the county to tell you that. So if we're really just not getting any state support, I would like to think it would be a pretty straightforward matter to just tell you we're not getting any. Or I mean, if what we're doing is we're struggling with the fact that we may have gotten like a $25,000 grant here or a $10,000 grant there, and that's what's holding up the answer. Maybe we could just say less than 100,000 or something like that. Yeah.
Question about wholesale capital improvements and cost sharing arrangements for capital improvements. Recall at the last task force meeting, we talked about the cost allocation model and how that works for O&M expenses. And for capital improvements for the cost allocation model on the water side, it's done with the same methodology. That's how capital projects are also portioned among the city, the county, and the wholesale partners. For wastewater, it's a little bit different in that the contractual relationship with the wholesale partners is with the county. The county enters into agreements with the wholesale partners and assigns capital cost responsibility based on those terms of those contracts, which is typically done by design flow. Next slide. A question about the impact of future capital costs. So this question can be taken several different ways. So I'm going to answer it 3 different ways. First, what are the future capital costs? In the last task force meeting, we presented what the city and the county's projected capital costs are through fiscal year 29. Another way to look at the question is, what is the impact on debt service? Because as you recall, the majority of the capital costs are funded are projected to be funded with debt. And we have that, we have some detail, a few slides later in this presentation. And the third way to look at it is, what is the impact of capital costs on rates? And that is one that is really not possible to answer at this time in this form. And the reason why is both the city and the county make rate proposals from time to time, and they do maintain financial projection models that look out in the future. But those conditions that inform financial projections are always changing. And so at the time when the city and the county are ready to make rate proposals, they use the most currently available information that's available at that future time. Further, the financial projections or rate projections, they combine all aspects of the utility operation and maintenance and capital. And so there isn't a they don't express rate impacts in terms of, well, this is how much is for capital and this is how much is for O&M. They combine them all together to generate a single series of water rate and wastewater rate schedules. Next slide. This is a question about outsourcing, split between in-house and outsourced work, including cost of outsourcing. So the typical outsourced work by the county is professional services, including some, but not all, certainly not all professional services, engineering, program management for consent decree compliance, hydraulic modeling in the water analyzer office, and other specialists like auditors and rate consultants. And those types of services are very common to be outsourced and hired third parties to do for a portion of these services. From the county side, no ongoing O&M is outsourced. For the city, it's the same type of professional services, engineering, program management for consent decree compliance, independent auditors, and similarly rate consultants and a bond consultant. And the city has outsourced some O&M generally due to hiring challenges, the inability to hire sufficient staff at their treatment plants. At this point, we don't have cost breakdowns for those yet. Next up. A question about the true-up process and a breakdown of the costs recovered through the annual true-up process. And so with the true-up process done, we went over this a little bit last time, is it recovers the differences in allocated costs for water supply and treatment and for the joint use wastewater facilities between estimates and the actuals. So what each partner, the city and the county, pays is based on actual costs at the end. If a true-up requires payment from the city to the county as a result of the true-up process, that payment comes from the respective water or wastewater utility, and it is deposited with the county's combined water and wastewater utility, and vice versa. If it's a payment from the county and the county uses its utility revenues to pay that payment, and it's deposited with the respective utility funds. So it all stays within the water and wastewater umbrella. We had a question about historical wholesale revenues. So this data was obtained from the city, and it's what they receive in wholesale revenues from the wholesale partners in Baltimore County. And there were some questions on it last time. And so the request is to prepare an annotated slide. So here it is. And the questions related to Anne Arundel County, in that between 2017 and 2021, there's a bunch of blanks in this table. And that is because Anne Arundel County didn't purchase any water during those years. About Baltimore County, the revenues shown include water and wastewater, and the wastewater revenues the wastewater revenues that the city receives from Baltimore County include what Baltimore County receives from the wholesale partners. Again, the contractual relationship is between the wholesale partners and the county. For Howard County, we noted that the 2020 payment was very large and the 2021 payment was very small. And the explanation from city staff is that the 2021 payment was recorded in the previous fiscal year. Another follow-up related to capital costs. We had a discussion of capital costs under the...
Just a second,
yeah.
Mr. Davis.
Quick question. So for 17 to 21, for Anne Arundel, where were they getting their water?
I don't know where Anne Arundel County gets most of its water supply, but even in the years they purchased water, they did not purchase all of their water from the city.
You know how much this represents? Like for one of those years, is it a quarter? Is it less than a quarter? Is it a fractional? I'm just wondering how much. And
well, we can find that out. Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Mitchell.
Just one question, and maybe Lauren, you can answer it. How much does Baltimore County receive from the other counties for those services related to, I think is wastewater, correct?
I don't have an answer for that, but I can certain that we could contact some people on your staff and find that out. Okay, so we had a follow-up question for capital costs. We had an as-is condition that we talked about at the last task force meeting. And the question when we reported the county's capital costs were, do those capital costs include contributions to the city? So recall that for the joint use wastewater facilities and for the water supply and treatment, the county pays its share of capital costs to the city up front. And so the county publishes its capital plan online. And if you go and look at it, there's good documentation of all the specific projects. And those projects do contain the capital contributions for those joint use and wholesale, what Neil was referring to as wholesale scope facilities. We had a question, several questions about debt. And so one of the questions arose from the discussion of how future capital projects, both the city and county intend to primarily use debt to pay for them. And so the question was asking, it was asking for a comparison of how much debt are we going to issue versus how much are we going to repay in that same period. And so that data is in this table. So what this table shows, there's 3 columns of numbers. From left to right, it's Baltimore City Water, Baltimore City Wastewater, and Baltimore County, which combines water and wastewater in its fund structure. The top line is the existing outstanding debt. We've shown that for comparison. And then the rest of the table is the projected change in debt. So the city and county anticipate from their various capital funding plans issuing new debt. You can see the amounts there. And from their debt service schedules that are available, you can add up all the debt they plan on repaying, all the debt principal, and you can see that as well. The bottom line is for Baltimore City Water, Baltimore City Wastewater, and Baltimore County, the amount of debt that these utilities will have on their books in 6 years will be greater than what it is now, because there are significant capital needs that are greater than the amount of debt they expect to repay in the meantime. Another follow-up question was a sensitivity analysis on interest rate and debt service. So what we show here is for $100 million of debt, it's a hypothetical number over 30 years, how the debt service changes with different interest rates. We have interest rates of 4%, 5%, and 6% shown. Okay. Yep. Okay. So another discussion that happened at the last task force meeting was in relation to the regional authority governance model, and it was talking about asset ownership versus debt issuance. And Neil touched on this a little bit with his example of Great Lakes Water Authority. But the question paraphrased is, so how does a new authority that doesn't own the assets, how do they issue debt? And the response is in the bullets on this slide. Debt financing can be separated from asset ownership, and the way to do that is through a form of a long-term agreement that some people might call a lease agreement or a facilities use agreement, where the asset owning entity, in this case, if you were to proceed with a regional authority, would be the asset owning entity would be the city and the county, would convey usage rights to the debt issuing entity, which would be the authority. This has been done. An example of a joint powers authority in California that is preparing to issue debt to finance water assets that will be owned by its member agencies, and then Great Lakes Water Authority as well. Okay, the next debt follow-up question was a discussion of AA versus AAA rated debt. As you recall, the city's debt is rated AA and the county's debt is rated AAA. So the table on this slide shows financial metrics used by rating agencies that assign these debt ratings, comparing AA and AAA. And there are 3 metrics shown: days cash on hand, which is how much money does a utility have in its reserves compared with how much it spends operating and maintaining the system on a daily basis. So AAA debt has requirements to get that rating of generally keeping more money in reserve. You can see the difference: greater than 250 days versus greater than 150 days for a AA rated debt. The next metric is debt service coverage. That measures how much revenue a utility collects above what it requires to pay its O&M expenses and its debt service. So again, AAA rated debt, you have to collect more money through revenues. And generally when you do that, you use that money to pay capital expenses on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the AAA debt requires a higher coverage ratio. That's the term that's used in the industry than AA debt. And then finally, debt to operating revenues. That's a ratio. It speaks to how much outstanding debt you have compared with how much money you bring in. So with AAA rated debt, you typically have less debt compared to your overall revenues. AA rated debt, if you have more debt, you would be more likely to get that AA rating. You can see the parameters there.
If you could hold on for a minute, Ms. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to clarify the question here because I think I raised this question. This looks like Moody's medians, their comparisons from the scorecard. I wanted to see the actual metrics from both the city and the county, understanding that things like days cash on hand and debt service coverage impacts rates. So want to know where they both sit. And if you have any recommendations or know how would those, in terms of becoming a single entity, if that's the direction, how would the difference in ratings, coverage ratios, days cash on hand impact the new entity? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the expression on Neil's face, and what I'm thinking is, I'm not sure that WSP is going to be able to answer the last part because that would be requiring very specific numbers that we have no idea what they would be for. I mean, we're going to make a recommendation for a governance structure, but I don't know if that recommendation would get so granular as to say, we recommend a regional water authority that keeps at least X amount of money on hand, and so I'm not sure how you could answer you could definitely ask for those numbers for the city and for the county. I don't know how you could project what those numbers would be.
To just clarify, not projecting what the numbers would be for the entity, but given the difference, because they are rated differently, they have, I would imagine they're meeting different coverage ratios. Is there an impact? Let me rephrase the question. Is there an impact in becoming a single entity from a financial standpoint to meet a different set of metrics in general?
And I think I'm going to echo part of at least what the chair said. We're here to help you vision what is the right governance model, not tell you what kind of bond rating you should get. So while that information, and we'll certainly check and see if we can make it available from the city, presuming, it might have to go back to the last time they sought a bond rating. And that would be where it would be available, I would presume. I'm not sure, Chair, you may know better than I if that information is tracked on a regular basis, but it doesn't sound like it is. But it's kind of the difference of, our charge is to get you to select and vision what the right model is. We're not going to give you specific financial advice about seeking what different rate it is. I think that, there could be a sensitivity in the sense of there will be a financial case, and the financial case might be able to look at it in terms of, what we said at the bottom, that different, the difference in those instances for AAA versus AA would be this. But we're not going to preempt your policy decisions in the future and say you should go for AAA. And there is no yes or no answer about will you get a AAA rating or a AA rating if you combine. There's certain things out there. It depends on the rating agency, for one. So there's no finite set of answers until you go do it. And these are policy decisions.
I could just take one more crack at it. In terms of recommending a specific structure, there will be financial implications. And part of that is going to be what is required in order to, it's going to be in the requirements, or the requirements are going to drive costs. And from an affordability, understanding anything that would impact affordability, that's what I'm trying to understand. So, however
I think I see the disconnect here is you're raising the point that how any entity, whether it's either the existing ones or a new third entity, how they choose to manage their money determines how much money they have available for things. And this was the issue we talked about previously about how try to put more money into reserves in the pursuit of a higher bond rating and lower interest on what money you do borrow. But if you do that, you have less money available to do PAYGO, which has no interest. And somewhere there's a line that each entity has to figure out for itself what it wants to focus on. And that's why I think WSP is going to have trouble answering your question the way you're asking it, because there is no consensus on which is better. Then I'm not understanding your question either.
So, as we're looking at a new model, we would have to also contemplate how the financials for each entity would be handled. They both have debt, and they're both perhaps they have different approaches to managing the finances. And we've talked about rate structures and how they're recovering costs. All of that is tied together. And just from the standpoint of being able to understand what factors will impact affordability for a new entity, I just want to make sure that I understand the considerations, because that's something, and I think we all would be, and it's been expressed by community members that should be a factor and a consideration, really looking at the affordability implications of any model that we move forward with, and all of the finances, the financial metrics, how they manage, what they try to achieve, and what would be achieved in the future is part of it. So I know you can't give specifics, but I'd like to see where the two entities are right now.
You could point out which aspects of this are driven by higher and lower rates for the rate payers.
We could certainly report out where the city water, city wastewater, and the county combined fund are in terms of their coverage requirements and their actual metrics. In the most recent data we have, if it's reported in a CAFR or something like that, we can certainly report out if there are any differences in the in the other metrics, days of reserve cash on hand.
I don't know if it's in the CAFR, but I know DPW has a spreadsheet with all of that information because it was part of the backup documentation for the last time we did rate setting.
Yeah. So we could certainly report that out. In terms of what does it look like for an authority, there are a lot of embedded policy decisions that would be future decisions, and that is the respective debt issuing strategy. So does the if a new authority has the ability to pool revenues and expenses, if it if it's a full merger or just the wholesale aspect that Neil had referred to in some of his other examples, you could theoretically, add the two together, but there are so many other factors that influence a bond rating that I'm not sure, and a debt issuing strategy that I'm not sure how predictive that would be of where an authority and their future policy decisions are going to end up.
To the best I can say is we did hear your question. We will endeavor to at least indicate where it fits, the sensitivity of a AA versus a single A bond, and we'll seek the information you asked for, which is the current status of where they sit. That much we can do. We'll do what we can to answer it, but there are just a litany of policy decisions that won't be made before by this particular group. They are the things that will be made by the group that follows up to implement this, that have even far more dramatic effect on affordability and equity. There will be a recommendation that is a consideration going forward. It will not be defined by us. It will be defined by the people that follow you, that are representative of your communities, that say this is what we want. We may highlight some things that should be there, but you need to decide, or your follow-on group that is busy in the formation will need to define what those are and how they will work. And it is only when that whole package is really there that you're going to say this. And I'm maybe foreshadowing the fact that if you think there's going to be a detailed financial forecast of what the authority looks like, that's probably not going to happen. You're going to see that there is potential positive impacts, or there is detrimental impacts on the factors. And here's, you've seen or will have seen by tonight, here are where they are now, and here are, in many instances, where they are forecast to go. One of the things that has not been addressed in any of the financial things, and one of the things we're going to have to talk about in the next meeting, is performance. So what are the changes that are sought in terms of performance, and what will they cost? So there are competing factors all around that are going to impact rates and affordability. And they are at the end things we can try to inform you on, but they're policy decisions by you and by the group that will implement this at the direction of whomever is in charge then. All right, so we'll do that much at very least, and see if we can do any more. I think we're just chair to check. We're at 8. We're still, or 7. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Are you still in debt? Good Lord, I thought we were that far behind.
I really thought, I knew that it felt like we'd been talking about this last subject for a little while, but I didn't think it had been 57 minutes.
All right.
So I think we're good.
You still have one more.
Okay. So continuing follow-ups on debt, cost of capital for refinancing existing debt, and issues around refinancing issued debt, that will be discussed later. Consulting with Maryland Department of the Environment and EPA on financing mechanisms, those are ongoing. We have talked to MDE. And the financial models for each jurisdiction, we touched on that a little bit earlier today in this discussion. Regarding rate setting, we had a question about how the collection of rates from commercial businesses occur in 2 circumstances. One is for commercial customers that aren't on the tax rolls, do they pay water rates? And the answer is yes. Another question was about commercial rates in arrears, commercial accounts with rates in arrears. And I would invite the city to respond, please.
Yes. There we go. Richard Luna, Interim Director, Department of Public Works. Currently, right now, we've started this process of being more aggressive in going after collections. So we've recently brought on a new attorney that's helping us and assisting in this effort. We have staff that are dedicated to this work. We've been sending out aggressive letters to our commercial accounts that we that have not been paying or that are in arrears. And we're actually forming a new city unit within our customer call center that's going to actually be connecting directly and engaging with those commercial accounts to make sure that those payments are received by the city. Yes.
Just a quick question. I know that the city has taken steps over the last few years to make it harder and harder to take an owner-occupied house or even other residential properties solely due to water bills that are overdue. I wasn't aware that we had any prohibitions from putting commercial property in tax sale for unpaid water bills. Have we been sending unpaid? Have we been sending properties with? Have we been sending with unpaid water bills to tax sale, and why not?
With our colleagues over at the Department of Finance, because they do handle the tax sale process, but we are sending those notices out currently to those commercial accounts, and we have staff that additionally go in after with those commercial accounts.
I only raise this issue because I know historically one of the reasons why DPW doesn't have what I will call a robust collections culture is historically we let tax sale do our collecting for us. But over the last, several years, we've been a little bit more equitable in trying to keep residential property from going that way. And I could understand if our collections problems now were focused on how do we collect from residential customers, given that we no longer have the threat of tax sale. But I was never aware that any effort was ever made to prevent commercial accounts from going to tax sale. So what, why is that hard? I guess I'm just confused, but I'm happy to get that information offline after you've had a chance to talk to finance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Ms. Buckler.
Another point that I want to recognize, because it's not always obvious what the division is between the city and the county. So because the city does the billing for the water accounts for the county customers, if there's customers not paying and there's no collections happening on that side, it's not happening for either jurisdiction. The other thing that you look at when you look at that is the cost allocation model, which is how we determine who pays what. And when we start talking about paying our fair share, which has come up at a lot of these meetings. So when water is unaccounted for, nobody paid for it, but we know where it went. We know what water went to the city addresses. We know what water went to the county addresses. At the end of the day, that jurisdiction picks up the tab for whatever is not paid. So if there's more unpaid accounts in the city residents as a whole are paying that tab when it comes to tallying up the total and who owes what. And the same for the county. If there's more unpaid in the county is paying that tab. And because the system has to be self-supporting, it doesn't get money from the general fund. It doesn't get money from other taxes or other resources. It's all what's generated from the bills for the water and the wastewater. So anyone not paying, your neighbor's paying for you at the end of the day is how it ends up working out.
Thank you. So the last question on this slide is, when was the last cost of service study done on, when did the city do its last cost of service? And that was done in 2016. It accompanied the change from the city's quarterly billing to monthly billing, and the cost of service study established the basis for the city's then new rate structure. We had a question about fire suppression fees. And to answer this question, it's, can you go back one? There you go. To answer this question, we need to break it up in between residential and commercial. So residential customers with sprinkler systems pay a fire suppression fee, $13 a month. A sprinkler system on a residential house requires a larger water meter than you would otherwise need if you didn't have one. So a residential customer with a sprinkler system, they pay a discounted water infrastructure fee. That's one of the other fixed charges that the city charges. So that's how it works for residential customers. For commercial customers, it's different. Commercial customers with fire service meters typically have a separate meter for their domestic water use and a separate meter for their fire service. The customers with the fire service meter pay a $14 a month fire protection fee, and the fire protection fee is the same for all meter sizes. It was established in the early 2000s. And so the question specifically that was asked was, how do we know all of the commercial customers with fire service meters are paying this? And the answer is that all the commercial fire services are metered, and the fee has been in place for over 20 years now. So the city knows where the meters are, and so therefore they know to establish a fire service account and charge the commercial customers accordingly.
Just a quick section, Senator McRae.
I was going to ask the specific year. I know you said 20 plus years, but like, how have we checked the accuracy from the historical standpoint? So has this been audited in the last 20 years is I guess what I'm asking.
Hello, Latoya Curtis, the acting chief of staff. So we're actually moving into the new billing system. So we've done a lot of data cleansing to cross-reference accounts from the old system to the new system. So that's currently being done now. And from my understanding, I wasn't here in 2016. It was done in 2016 as well when we went to the new system back then.
I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you right. So typically you have an agency and then you have someone independent of the agency check to make sure that the agency is doing what they say they're going to be doing. When was the last time, from a historical standpoint of the implementation, had someone audited to make sure that we caught the historical accounts?
We're currently doing that now. I started in this division a couple of years ago, and since then we do data cleansing quite often, and now we're moving to our new system. So data cleansing is being done now as we're migrating.
I'll ask my question offline.
Okay.
Some more follow-up questions. Fixed versus volumetric charges. So during the last task force meeting, we had a discussion of the various water and sewer rates that are charged by the city and the county. And so the graph I'm showing you here is a repeat of what that was for a refresher. On this graph, blue is water, green is sewer. It shows a total monthly cost of water and sewer service for a hypothetical customer. This is a customer using 8 CCF or 800 cubic feet of water per month. And so the next slide shows that same data, but broken out differently. The solid dark colored bands are the fixed charges. Again, blue is water and green is sewer. And the rest of the graph, the lighter pattern parts, are the volumetric charges. And so based on this example, 8 CCF per month, 21% of the city bill is fixed charges. The remainder is volumetric charges. 44% of the county bill is fixed charges. The remainder is volumetric charges. And these percentages are going to vary for every single customer because everyone has a different water bill based on how much water they use, what their meter size is, or what type of customer you are. So for example, some portions of the county's rate structure are different depending on if you're a residential customer, a commercial customer, or an industrial customer. In general, the county relies more on fixed charges than the city does. So the final follow-up section is regarding pensions. We had an as-is condition discussion at the last task force meeting, and we wanted to elaborate on a few things. And to do that, we need to define a few terms. And the terms pension obligation, that is the amount that is due retirees. It does not mean it's a lump sum that anybody owes right now. It's a stream of payments over time when employees retire. Net position, that is the actual amount of money available in the pension fund to pay those obligations. And the net or unfunded pension obligation is the difference between the two. It's the difference between what the stream of payments that you're going to owe and what you have today to make those payments. Talking about the city's pension plan, the city employees are covered by the city's pension plan. It's a defined benefit plan established in the 1920s, and the benefit provisions are established by city ordinance. By the county has its own pension program, and it is also a defined benefit plan established in the 40s, and the authority to establish and maintain the plan is established in Baltimore County Code. Comparing the two, the plans are different. The benefits are expressed as a percentage of salary. That percentage depends on hiring date and length of service. The percentages vary between the city and county for those different parameters. The implications, particularly under the regional authority model, we'll discuss. Regarding the amount of pension funding, the net pension obligation, again, the difference between what you have, the assets the pension funds hold now and what they're required to pay in the future, is the net pension obligation per water and wastewater employee in the city is about $35,000 per employee, and for the county it's higher than that, about $70,000 per employee. It is common for utilities to have a net pension obligation on their books. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Neil to continue.
Thank you, Art. So we're finished with the questions from last week and have our new list for next week. I do want to begin to talk about the models. And we're going to kind of reverse the order tonight and talk about the special district model first. You've seen this slide. This was on last workshop. But some of the things, again, that are there: utility policy and decision-making, rate setting, capital planning. These are some of the determinants that are in the House bill for the evaluation. So again, I'm not going to read this, but these are the entities that would have those responsibilities under this particular model. So we're going to kind of keep moving on with what are a little bit more detail. That the authority's board would be the final authority that makes all of the kind of policy decisions, certainly about the conveyance and distribution system and the wastewater joint facilities or the total facilities. And there's a litany of things listed underneath in terms of just representative policy decisions. The board could consist of appointed elected officials for accountability. And there are things that could come in the recommendation about what they would be required to do and the frequency that they might do it. In terms of audited financials, we've had questions and discussions about auditing different things and cost of service studies. There are two kind of options that have indicated in this before that are important to kind of make sure everybody's following along. That there is the potential of an authority that is a wholesale authority with, similar to the Great Lakes case, the city could retain the local operation of the system and the local obligations that are associated with it, and correspondingly the county could retain its local district obligations for its water and sewer things. So the wholesale, analogous to what is cost shared for the joint facilities and the water treatment, distribution, and conveyance, could be considered wholesale. So again, kind of going back to my glossary terms, wholesale, retail. And you have also the options of uniform rate and district rates. So in the context of either case, for that matter, you have the notion that everybody could, in a given rate class. So we've talked about rate designs. They're residential, small residential, big residential, industrial, commercial rates. So that's rate design. Everybody in one of those categories across the entirety of the authority could pay a similar or the same rate. In a district situation, because there could be reasons to consider differences in expenses of the districts for the retail portion, you could also have that as a district rate. So there would be, the wholesale rates would be fundamentally the same. So the services in terms of the backbone services would be all cost the same. But the retail side of services, those maintained by the districts or the city and the county, would have different rate setting. So a couple of important distinctions just to make sure we follow along till we get to the recommendation and decision of what makes sense. So for the wholesale service provider, they would provide, set the, for the authority would set the, or for the, if there were district, the city would retain the retail system and set the O&M rates and collections, and the counties would do basically the same.
Neil?
Yes.
There was an item that I thought we discussed at the last meeting that I'm not seeing reflected on this sort of snapshot of general topic, which was the idea of a potential the potential idea of a separate rate setting board that several other cities have, where that is the one thing that the board that deals with operations doesn't do. Is the board that deals with operations just tells the rate setting board, this is how much money we need for doing all the stuff that we want to do. But then it's sort of a, I guess I'm going to call it a fire break, because you want to have the accountability, as you mentioned, of the elected officials on the actual board for dealing with all of the day-to-day policies and the operations. But one of the things that we know historically is that if those same elected officials are also the ones that are responsible for setting rates, they're going to put off raising rates as long as possible, because nobody who's elected wants to make voters unhappy by raising rates. And when that's been done in the last 15 or 20 years, it's only because it didn't get done enough in the preceding 30 or 40. And I would hope that we would not set a new entity up to fail in such a similarly spectacular way. So could we make sure that we have that as an option to continue to discuss?
Certainly, I think there are generally two kind of categories of boards set up. The one that we did mention, which is political people representing, to have accountability to the political bodies that they're affiliated with in principal part. It's hard for a city councilman or a mayor sitting on a board to say, if I'm sitting on the sewer board, that I didn't know about it and that the city didn't know about it. Conversely, there are other boards that are explicitly limited to people that have knowledge of running utilities and are not politically collected. So that really, you could have those two as kind of considerations going forward. And clearly, there are other agencies that we've looked at, even in the list of things that we gave you, that have kind of a third-party rate setting board. I can't tell you offhand what the configuration of them are, but they're clearly.
Like I know Philadelphia has one.
Yeah, and I don't know whether it was St. Louis, but one of the Midwestern cities has something akin to that.
It's just that the reason I'm raising this is that I remember I very distinctly from our first meeting when we were going through what is now slide 7, but it was the different aspects laid out in the HB 843. The last one on the list was rate stability for customers. Correct. And one of the conversations we had is we have to worry about rate stability for customers, but we also have to worry about rate sufficiency for the system to make sure that we don't want to overburden residents, but we also want to make sure that we are collecting enough money so that we can actually do the work that needs to be done and pay the people who are doing the work sufficiently such that we're getting and keeping good people. So that's why I'm just saying it's sort of a hidden, a little prize there that we have to find the best way in which we can set those rates while continuing to provide accountability for operations, but not relying on those most heavily accountable people to also raise their own constituents' water and sewer rates on a whatever the needed basis is. So, oh, and I'm sorry, I'm going to take this opportunity to once again remind all task force members, as unpleasant as put your mouth right down here by the microphone, because we have gotten reports that not everybody is being heard live stream. Thank you.
All right, I'll continue on about a little bit about rate structures. So again, this is kind of highlighting again, because I'm kind of a believer you got to mention it 2 or 3 times before people begin to pick it up, that you could have a uniform rate. It could be across an entire authority, and everybody would pay the same rate in the same rate class within the jurisdictions. You could have a district rate, where you still have the essentially the infrastructure in the background being maintained, and have a district rate where there could be a district rates that are different in the cities, particularly if it's a wholesale utility where the retail side was still managed by the city and the county. So a couple of distinctions. Any such distinction, any such governance would have to have a clear path to how you resolve disputes. So that's just kind of common sense. In the transition approach, we wanted to start laying out the principles of the transition approach. You saw some of the examples. Probably one that's closer to, I think, what the task force is looking at, maybe kind of the Great Lakes. Certainly, the issues are different than Tampa Bay water. We will have some additional information on some other transitions that's still coming in. So it would be to establish work groups to look at what are the respective issues, and they would be, the utility directors, the appointed either board members or some board surrogates from the respective members that would sit on the board. So that would have to be made up. And under the district authority, it's kind of what are your work issues? What do you have to do rates? You have to do, what is the cost of service? You're going to have to work out a lot of financial stuff. So you have work groups that you're going to have to identify what the issues are and the outcomes. You have the options of looking at how much internal resources you use, or whether you really do need to outsource this to keep it on, perhaps as an expedited schedule. Art kind of asked me, the degree to which you outsource or insource the resources, is that related to potentially the schedule? And the answer is yes, but it also relates to the cost. So again, it's a balance of what's the most reasonable approach to manage this at a reasonable cost, and still fits all the needs. So then you have to procure the additional support, and then obviously go through the process to grind the meat and make the sausage to come out with the authority's charter or whatever the outcome. And that fundamentally is the same outline process, no matter which one you're going to. It's just going to take less for the intermunicipal agreement one, because the tenants are fundamentally there. It's just changing them. So in the 2 new governance models, you'd have a lot more time. So I'm going to talk about initial thoughts about transition costs and timeline. Again, we've kind of said that timelines are likely 12 months to 24 months. And that's from the time that you kind of have the the final go. So this is, as Chair, you said, after the legislature has decided what it's going to do, or the flag is dropped on the group to do this. This is from then to when it's going to be finished, not from today or the end of this task force. It's contingent, as you said, on what human resources are utilized. And, this is, again, kind of where we got into, there's so much myriad of policy decisions that impact what you need to do in the transitions. It kind of gets to be piling assumptions on piling assumptions as to what the costs are. So our approach that we're going to take is we are going to pursue, as I said, what Great Lakes costs. We are going to pursue at least 2 others to get an idea of what other transition costs, and we will use some version of that in light of these benchmarks. For now, we kind of benchmark your inside costs are at least $250,000, and I'm pretty confident if you go to one of the regional authorities, you're looking at $1 million plus as transition costs, but we will dimension that hopefully by the next meeting. So this is kind of a bookmark, and this does not include anything associated with any pension transition. So Art has mentioned kind of some of the dollar order of magnitude dollars that could be involved in dealing with some of the pension transitions. And I think we're going to talk about that a little more, but that's just it's not involving that. And I'm going to switch.
So for some of the more specific criteria with financial impacts, you're going to see a phrase in some future slides that says most of the impacts will depend on future policy decisions and negotiated outcomes, and that is very true for many of these items. In terms of asset lease, the phrase asset lease has 2 different meanings with respect to a regional authority. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. There are 2 different meanings, and the first meaning I'm going to talk about is addressed on the second 2 bullets on this slide, and that is what the city and county. Oh, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it. So the second 2 bullets speak to the existing things that the city and county leases now as a course of doing business, and those are primarily real estate, vehicles, and software. And compared to the overall size of the utility, for example, the cost allocation model allocates approximately $500,000 a year in leased facilities. So the regional authority effect on those asset leases is pretty small. I mean, the leases would be transferred to an authority, and the existing real estate leases would have to be looked at to dictate if they are transferable, but that comes with other discussions about housing and office locations. Second meaning of asset leases is along the lines of Neil's Great Lakes Water Authority example, where the assets are retained they would be retained by the city and the county in this case, and leased to a new authority. That's a very different meaning of asset lease. And so for a regional authority, that has the potential to be a major future consideration, and how that lease payment, if at all, would be structured and calculated is a future policy decision. Generally, asset leases are done based on asset value, but there's a lot of considerations that go into that. Towards capital costs. So the district or authority formation would require reconciliation of currently projected capital improvement programs. We had a brief conversation with the Maryland Department of Environment about consent decrees and how consent decrees, or if consent decrees, would be not renegotiated, but perhaps reorganized to fit a different governance alternative structure in a wholesale or in a regional authority. The capital costs would be decided by the new authority, and the capital projects, of course, would be prioritized that way. Billing and collections. We've talked about this before under a regional authority. If the billing and collections is consolidated into the new authority. That would be consolidated, staffed by the new authority and aligned with the jurisdiction limits of the authority, which would require establishing one set of billing and collection policies, where now there are two sets. Under Neil's example, where the retail water services continued to handle by the existing entities, that would be different. So, but if the umbrella of the authority covers all aspects of water and sewer service, then the new authority would have to make policy decisions about how to reconcile differences in billing and collections. There are certainly some transition costs with migrating all data to one billing system. The county is in the process of converting to the same system as the city. So that actually is something that is underway now. And there could be potential cost savings if you do consolidate customer service billing and collection. And I think Neil is foreshadowing meeting number 5 when we're going to pivot to performance. For rate restructuring, Neil has stolen a lot of my thunder on this slide in talking about uniform rates versus district rates. But it does require reconciliation if the new board elects to have a uniform rate of the various different rate structures. There are significant differences in how they're collected, when they're collected, and what the charges are. That being said, a new authority should include affordability considerations. It should include equity considerations when developing rate structures. Those are critically important to the community, and they should be considered here. And the affordability programs should be available to both city and county customers. So now we're going to talk about debt some more. And so with a new authority, we have 3 slides to show you: one for the city water utility, one for the city wastewater utility, and one for the combined county water and wastewater utility. And the question has come up, do you need to refinance debt? And so that is a legal assessment, and that Neil has provided some examples of where that wasn't necessary via facilities use agreements or some type of a conveyance of asset lease agreements. So it's not a given that this has to happen, but if it did have to happen, or if a governing board chose to do this, we have estimated some costs, financial implications of that. And the cost is presented in a range, and the cost that you see on this slide, 90 to 200 million, is a present value. Of course, if an authority was to refinance debt, it would borrow money, use those proceeds to pay back the debt held by the city water utility, the city wastewater utility, and the county combined utility. And then the county would be responsible, or excuse me, the new authority would be responsible for making those debt payments. So one of the major factors is an understanding of what exact debt needs to be refinanced, and in particular, the state SRF loans. For example, we had preliminary conversations with MDE about this subject. So I'm not saying that they have concluded those could be assigned or transferred. I'm saying that that is the basis for the difference, the primary basis between the difference between the high and low value. But you can see the financial impact is large, and this is just for the city's water utility debt. Similarly, similar analysis. Yeah.
All right, hold on for a second.
Yeah.
Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Just one quick question. The 90 to 200 million present value, is that debt service up and above what currently the city and county is paying for that? Or could you explain that a little bit more so we can understand?
Yeah, totally. So the city has, the city's water utility, I'm going back to some of my own slides here, has about $1.5 billion of outstanding water utility debt. That's how much debt it owes right now. And so if a new authority were to borrow money to pay that off, it would have to make debt service payments at today's interest rates on all of the money that it borrows. And if you took those debt service payments on an annual basis and compared them with what the city's current debt service payments are, the refinance debt would have a higher payment. And so if you took a present value of all of those differences in payments over the years, it would be between 90 and $200 million.
Do you have an estimate of what that would be per year for that refinance? So the present value could be between 90 to 200 million, but what does that mean in actual payments per year? What number did you use for that?
I don't have that with me right now. We can follow up on what those assumptions are.
It's perfect. And then two, would that increase? How would that be absorbed? Who would pay for that?
So that's a very good question. And we've been talking about funds, right? We've been talking about the city's water fund and the city's wastewater fund. These are called, in government lingo, enterprise fund. That means water pays for water. So if you had to refinance and you chose to refinance, the additional costs would come from the water utility. So that's the reason for going back with some of these examples of facility use agreements, for example, that in other areas made it possible so that this expense didn't have to be paid.
Makes sense. And one last question, I promise. This is only the city's water debt. This doesn't include the sewer, wastewater, and the county water and wastewater, correct?
So true. And that is the next slide. Okay. So the next slide, Neil. Yep. Nope. There you go. That's the wastewater debt. Wastewater debt has a range of 130 to 340 million. Same story about the amount of debt, the legal question of if you need to refinance it and the range of values. And then the next slide after that is the county metro district. That is the term the county uses, and its defined district area for its water and wastewater systems. And that's 105 to 185 million. So the next slide is a table that sums it all up. And so the rows are the city water utilities, city wastewater utilities, county metro. Columns are no refinancing, low case and high case on the refinancing. And again, this, these are large dollar amounts, obviously. And this speaks to the effort that other utilities have put in place to avoid these costs.
So, just a quick question. I should look further ahead to check before I ask this, but it doesn't look like we have a separate slide to talk about what can we do to avoid these costs, or is that still we're waiting to hear back from bond counsel?
Well, I think the answer is you can, at least in theory, and again, you'd have to go through bond counsel. You'd have to go through a lot of people to render their opinions.
We'd have 370 to 725 million reasons to do that.
Right. So, this to me is kind of one of those really determinant slides. It makes sense that in light of the fact that you have debt you've accumulated at low interest rates, the interest rate environment is significantly ticked up. If you have to refinance, it may be a bit of the tail that wags the dog. So, it's going to lean our recommendation certainly to look at what are options to not refinance the debt and pursue a some form of lease type use agreement to preserve the debt and basically structure the payments to pay those debt down through whatever the payment mechanism is that's defined. So that's, and very candidly, those fees have to be paid by customers. So
to practice my reflective listening, which failed me with Keisha, and I still feel bad about that.
I still think it's all time.
Okay. Just to make sure that I'm doing this right, this amount of potential refinancing cost, not the debt, but the cost of refinancing the debt, is large enough that it itself may determine what option we choose. It could conceivably be a part of that decision right here, just this alone, unless there are ways in which this option can be structured to allow us to avoid paying this cost. Because the third option that I was initially considering when Dr. Mitchell was like, well, who pays that? You know, I'm like, my first thought was, well, there's always our good friends at the state who we know want to be partners in this. But the honest to God truth is, if the state is in a position to give us $370 to $725 million to make all this work better, I'd much rather they give it to us to actually fix stuff rather than just pay banks a higher interest rate. So let's see if we can figure out what the actual legal ways we could do this without having to pay the refinancing cost, because otherwise that's its own significant con in the overall list of pros and cons.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate.
Thank you. Neil, to the extent that a significant portion of this debt is owed to the state, to MDE, is MDE, did you say they haven't gone back to you as to whether this debt that's owed to MDE could be assumed by the new entity so that current terms would apply? No, wouldn't have to be refinanced.
In fairness to them, I don't think we put the question to them like that at this point. We were there primarily to identify what the debt was. And at that point, I think what they said is, you know, we have experience where we have moved things around, permits and loans and things, to consolidate them. So that could happen. They did not in any particular case say that will happen, or we will assure you that will happen in this case.
Could you follow up with them on that, since that seems to be a big potential cost if they didn't allow assumption of the loan obligations?
Yep, most definitely. So I think we're back still with you, Art. Pension obligations.
So with pension obligations, again, there are some future policy decisions that are going to be relevant. And the first is whether you choose, or you or your successors choose, to create a new pension plan or rely on the existing city and county pension plans. And if you create a new pension plan for existing employees, making sure that the assets would be transferred to the new authority, the existing assets for the existing employees, in a way that doesn't adversely affect any benefits to be received by any new employees. And then also considering reconciling the differences in the various pension in the cities and the counties pension plans that exist right now.
Do we have any examples of similar situations where they resolved this by simply letting the employees stay in the existing plans and letting new employees choose which plan they want to be in?
To the first part of your question, and in a very brief discussion, and yes, we will follow up, but I believe that's what Great Lakes had indicated, that the payments for the pension were to retain the employees that were transferred in that pension system. So they didn't transfer out of the Detroit sewer system pensions. They were just, the payments flowed through the authority, through a trust to them to pay that. So they didn't get, I believe they didn't get transferred. I don't know the answer to the second part. We just didn't have that much time.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Back to me. This is kind of the summary snapshot of what's happening with the water and wastewater. So impact and asset leases, obviously, we've had quite a discussion about, a major form of lease between the city and a new authority in terms of those assets, and that would be a key outcome and decision. Obviously, very important. The impact on capital costs. The impact on capital costs are the two programs have to probably continue because they're designed to meet the existing obligation and existing known needs and existing known needs. There will be at some point an assessment of additional needs. That would be something the authority would undertake once formed. So there could be other program changes, but as you're paying consent orders and making capital improvements that are pretty well needed, it's essentially the fact that you're going to combine the two existing programs. Impact on building collections. I think they're moving towards consolidated into one IT platform. I think that there is discussion then about staff by new authority based on the authority's jurisdiction. So depending on which rate setting scheme you decide upon, they would do that all there. The authority would have to reconcile all of the rates that they have, but once they set their rates, that would be established by the authority's decisions and policies through whatever mechanisms are within their kind of governance structure to perform, and it could be a third-party board. The debt obligations would be consistent with the charter or obligations. Obviously, what are the jurisdictions, and they would be determined by the authority. So the capital programs, once the authority takes over, would be the responsibility of the authority's board. So they would make the final decisions. There would be a process for capital planning, hopefully a transparent process. So that would be part of it. And the transition of the pensions, I think it's the same fundamental approach. If you can maintain the existing pensions and that makes sense, you try to do that and not necessarily transition them. There are some benefits to transitioning into a new program, but those again are kind of policy decisions. You want to attempt to do this transition on what is at least the least possible cost basis. So that's kind of the approach that's there. You'll likely see something to the effect of, we would recommend you pursue what are the legalities of being able to maintain the current posture of the employees, and the decision is probably, what do you do in the future with new employees? So, and that's a pretty common approach, I believe.
Neil, what I'm going to suggest is we seem to be at a really good break point before we start the fiscal analysis for Model D. We're almost at the point where we would be stopping normally for our break. And then, so what I'm going to suggest is that we do what we did at the last meeting, which is we take a relatively quick break, be back at 8:05, and then go immediately to public comment and take public comment for as long as there is public comment. And then at the conclusion of public comment, we'll resume the presentation and discussion on the fiscal analysis for Model D and Model C. That way, the people who have sat patiently for the last 2 hours listening to us talk have a chance to talk themselves before we go back to talking. So with that, it's 7:57. Let's just take a couple minutes to avail ourselves of stretching, and we'll try to be back at 8:05. Thank you. Let's pull that up here. I'm not going to say that I haven't enjoyed these in-person meetings, but I want to say that one of the parts that's been most entertaining and enjoyable has been the slightly different seating arrangements we've had at each meeting. These seating arrangements are done by staff ahead of time in an effort to keep us all on our toes. I believe that tonight's configuration is subtitled Task Force: The Last Supper. All right. I am, and this is the point where I mentioned to BR that I'm still not seeing a sign-in sheet in my email. It's on its way. Okay. How about this? Can you just call out the first person? David Wheaton. All right. I've been watching you. I could tell you had something to say. All right, Mr. Wheaton. And instead of giving you the customary 2 minutes, you have until I get the list for whoever is next.
Great. I'll take all the time I can get. Thank you, task force members. My name is David Wheaton with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I just have 3 kind of points and / questions. I know that y'all are looking at Detroit as one of your models. And one of the things I wanted to point out with Detroit is after they did go to their regional authority, they had about 140,000 shutoffs in Detroit from 2014 to 2020 that disproportionately impacted Black residents. So just wanted to see what the task force is going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen here in Baltimore. The second thing in Tampa, another system that y'all are looking at, after Tampa had their regionalization system go into place, there were multiple treatment plants that privatized. And I know with ballot question E in the city of Baltimore, we know that city residents rejected privatization. So how are we going to make sure that treatment plants in the regional authority doesn't sell off to privatize any of the water that Baltimore residents have already rejected? And then my third thing is something that I've brought out before are the lease payments and what an equitable lease payment would be to the city of Baltimore. Again, this is the city of Baltimore's largest asset. It's a multi-billion-dollar asset. And so what is the lease payment? What is the city of Baltimore going to get back? City residents have been paying into this water system since 1854. They've been putting millions and millions and millions of dollars to the city water system. And so what is the city going to get back in return just to lease it to a new entity? As I mentioned at last meeting, UC Cal Berkeley did a study of Detroit's water system. They said it should have been a $5 billion lease payment if it was an equitable lease payment. And so I know this task force wants to make sure that this is, again, an equitable process. So again, what would an equitable lease payment be to the city of Baltimore, and would that fall back on ratepayers? And so that's just something for the consultants to consider, and something for the task force members to consider as they make the choice for if they're going to choose a regional authority. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you very much. You can go ahead and sit down. I am gonna speak to some of what you said, because I had already said earlier when we were talking specifically about Detroit and the Great Lakes Water Authority that not speaking for the task force, but speaking for myself, a lot of the points that were made about how that deal worked, I think we should be looking at as a cautionary tale. Like that I'm not saying that Detroit in and of itself is a reason that we should not recommend an authority. I'm just saying that we should be using Detroit and Great Lakes Water Authority as examples of both how an authority can work and how it could work badly, so that we don't replicate the parts that didn't work well. The other thing I want to, again, stress, and this goes back to our first meeting and where I do feel comfortable speaking for the task force, we all agreed at our very first meeting that we would not be making a recommendation towards privatization of the water and wastewater system, and that we would not be making a recommendation that would involve the asset no longer being owned by the city of Baltimore. If we do not recommend something that is being owned by someone else, then someone else can't sell it. If we recommend an authority where we are leasing the system to a quasi-governmental entity that is going to be responsible for day-to-day operations and management, that means the city of Baltimore is leasing its system to that entity, which means it is up to the city of Baltimore to write it into the lease. You cannot sublease big chunks of the system to somebody else. That is one of the things that would stay with the city as a capability, as long as the understanding is that the ownership of the system stays with the city. The next person that we have signed up here is Jorge Aguilar. And I'm a little nervous because Javon isn't signed up. Is that on purpose? Oh, okay. All right. Because I wanted to make sure you got your card stamped so that you could show that you'd been at all of them. Okay. All right. Okay, Jorge, 2 minutes.
Hello there. Hey, yes, my name is Jorge Aguilar. I am with Food and Water Watch also, well as Jomar. So we're here representing 10,000 Baltimore members. Thank you, Chair Henry. And I want to thank you. I know you've spoken quite a bit about privatization, and I'm looking at my phone because I have some of the numbers here. We're extremely concerned that this economic figures presented today, including ones that would count similar arrangements made in Detroit, lead us at least to estimate that the total cost could be between 1.7 billion and 2 billion to transition the system that will ultimately be passed on to Baltimore region families. So the consultants right now are estimating that depending on this future legal analysis, a new authority could need to refinance the existing debt at a cost of 370 to 725 million. Friends, this is the last in-person meeting, and we still don't know the answer to the legal question. Just kind of strange not to know at this point, but I'll keep adding. There are other costs, right, including yet unquantified retirement benefit, transition costs, and potentially lease payments. So our own water analysis from past work in Detroit found the new authority there paid $344 million in pension contributions to ensure the city met its promise to its workers, and an additional $976 million in lease payments over the term of that deal. So that's what's adding up to the figure I gave you in the billions. All of these additional costs will be passed on to customers of the system and will really deepen at least Baltimore cities, as well as the counties, but the city's real water affordability crisis, which disproportionately affects mostly Black Baltimore residents. We're really disappointed that any Baltimore city official would anyway be comfortable with transitioning away this system that's estimated to be at a $5 billion asset at this price that we're mentioning. And for any county official to compare the Detroit bankruptcy to the situation is very, very unfortunate, given that all of the costs will be passed on to county residents also, while at the same time that the county is looking to appropriate a city asset without any equity analysis of how this will impact low-income and communities of color. This just doesn't endanger a lot of faith in this task force's ability to come up with a good plan for transitioning. Even the pledge to not privatize is in doubt, given the model that consultants are using is Tampa Bay, which David mentioned, did privatize its system, its operation and management, to one of the largest international corporations in the world. Mr. Henry, Chair Henry, I know you mean the best, Once you turn it over to a nonprofit, it's a whole other entity that controls what is done. That's how we've seen it done in other places. Privatization is not just ownership. It is management, operation. It could be any number of things. That's what we mean by privatization. So we don't want that. And I don't think there's any clause you can put in there that could prevent privatization in the future. That's just not how it works legally. Hasn't been explored. But I finally want to end with really urging this task force to take a step back and withhold making any recommendation to state officials who seem to be really pushing this behind the scenes, or as the consultant put it, the ones who are dropping the flag on you. This plan has too many unanswered questions. And what we already know shows that this will be extremely painful to Baltimore families. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
I just wanted to ask a question because you guys, not you personally, but your group has come and testified at all of them. And I hear you loud and clear on affordability, and that's your concern. What is your ask of what happens next besides affordability? What happens governance-wise with the system?
Are you suggesting we make a recommendation? Well,
I'm asking this. You've got the floor. So, what is your recommendation of what happens with the governance of the water and wastewater system?
And if I could sort of just slightly narrow the frame, it's been made very clear that you have concerns about a regional water authority as a potential governance structure. Do you have a preference?
correct. There's been some talks of reforming the Board of Estimates, I believe it is, which sets rates. There's been some conversations potentially, right, where that could have a little bit more input from the county beyond rates. So there's other models that don't.
I haven't heard anyone suggest that we reform the Board of Estimates in a way that gives the county access to being part of that body. And I'm not sure, given the current structure of city government, how you could give the city a voice in the Board of Estimates without it being highly disruptive to the rest of city government.
Well, you asked, I was asked the question of what we prefer. Yeah. That's a no, but right, what this task force and the legislators who set up this task force seem to have had a conclusion that the authority is already the best course of action versus no course of action or potentially other courses of action. So we are really sort of like going like down this very slippery slope without a lot of questions being answered. And it's clear that the county in particular, right, the county, there's different interests here, and the county certainly has an interest in getting, right, control over this system in a way that it doesn't, whereas the interest of the city is separate. They own the system. And sure, it has its challenges, but there's a lot of different ways that this could go. The county has expressed, and they passed a resolution that they were supportive of finding some sort of privatization deal. This is a couple years ago. So they are on the record. So the county's vision may be very different than what the city's vision is. And like I said, that's why I'm urging this task force, who's been really in the weeds on this, to not make that recommendation. Don't fall for whatever really state officials are trying to push forward in an expedited way, and to really think through this, to do it right. This has very little sort of public comment, right? I think the general public doesn't even know that this is happening, very little press around it. So that's why I urge you to sort of hold back on making any recommendation at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do want to thank you for that feedback. That was really helpful. And I do just want to say, as the county, working for the county, representing the county on this board, there's not any vote about privatization that I am aware of and that I have been angling for on this board.
So we have one more person signed up, but Antoinette Ryan Johnson. Oh, I'm not going to say that I couldn't see you behind Christine, but okay.
And I'm going to be brief, Mr. Chair. So good evening, Chair Henry and members of the Regional Water Governance Task Force. My name is Antoinette Ryan Johnson, and I am the president of the City Union of Baltimore, AFT Local 800, representing thousands of city employees, including over 400 city DPW workers employed in the city water and wastewater system. Even though the legislation that created this task force made clear that one clear task is to assess how different models may improve recruitment, retention, and training for its workforce, details on these specific asks seem to be missing. As I said, I'm going to be very brief tonight. The City Union of Baltimore is, of course, very concerned with the issues of recruitment, training, and retention, and as such calls for the task force and whatever model it chooses moving forward. We recommend that all employees of the city and county water systems remain in the established bargaining units, that they do not lose their unionization rights and have any of their unions decertified as their representatives. Furthermore, the task force should call for a study to look at the salary, pay, and benefits of employees of the water system to identify areas in which the systems are falling behind and losing valuable employees to competitors. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I believe Senator McCray wanted to add a comment.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just, as a state representative, as the person that represents the 45th Legislative District and a representative for the Maryland State Senate, I just wanted to let folks know, especially the listening public, that when we created this legislation, the intent was to explore. When systems are in place for 30, 40, 50 years, and they're not working at some point in time, when it faces challenges as a system standpoint, it faces challenges on the people that consume or patronize the system, it's important to reevaluate. And I think that the legislation was very clear in reference to the intent, not simply saying, look at this one thing, but look at all things and figure out if there's an opportunity to best serve our consumers that are here and that we serve from that standpoint. So I just wanted to make that clear to the listening public. It's a number of folks in the audience. I saw that the state was represented. And as a state representative, if I didn't say anything and stayed silent from that standpoint, I think I would be doing my colleagues a disservice. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to take this opportunity to ask WSP, because we were reminded in testimony tonight from Food or Water Watch, and I believe they sent an email this afternoon that was shared with all the task force members, that will be shared with all the task force members. And one of the issues that was raised, I was curious about getting more information on, and that was the idea that if the water and wastewater system itself is an asset on the city's books of some particular number, I think it was $5.5 billion. If that asset is on the city's books at that value, and we lease that asset to a separate entity like an authority for a long-term basis, with the understanding that they are responsible for all of the operations and upkeep and improvement of the system, is there anything that requires the city to then take the asset off of its books? Because that was a concern that was presented. And if that were a legitimate concern, that would be a significant one, because I imagine that would have a substantial impact on the city's overall financial state and, our bond rating, if suddenly $5.5 billion worth of assets disappeared overnight. But that being said, it did not seem intuitive that that would happen, because if you own an asset and you lease it, it's still your asset. And even if we weren't leasing it for a, whatever present value would be appropriate for the actual value of the overall asset, I I didn't think it would come off our books, but can we get a confirmation of that just to put that concern to rest, as part of the information that you put together for us before the next meeting?
Yeah, again, part of that is a bit legal, but as you kind of, if anybody's ever leased a car or heard of a car, the lease terms are in there as to what the termination rights are and who owns it. So, I mean, that's a customary term of the lease. We may ask to get some consultation with one of the city or county's, probably city's attorney, but I think that can be addressed.
And I get I get that this isn't a simple, easy question that you can just give me a block. Yeah, but I do think it's important that we address this matter, because if that is not the case, if we are actually in some way, from a financial perspective, losing that asset by leasing it to another entity, then that would make our statements about the city not selling it just lip service. Like, so, yeah, okay. I think with that, that's the end of what we had for public comment, unless anyone thinks that they signed up and I didn't call their name. Otherwise, I think we're going to turn it back over to WSP and try to see if we can get through Model D and Model C in the remaining time.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, they're a little bit simpler. In the last model is pretty much an analog, although with some modifications of what you're presently doing. So that's going to run through simply, but we'll run through D, the wholesale service provider. And in this particular case, given that the assets are in fact owned by the city, we're presumed that the wholesaler would be the city. So the policy for the utility and its decision-making would be by the service provider, by the city, and the purchasing utilities would be responsible for anything that they retained in their jurisdiction. Rate setting would kind of follow the same role. Wholesale rates set by the wholesale provider, the city, and any retail rate issues would be set independently by the city and county or other members. The capital planning in this particular case would probably fall further back and on the city, since they are the wholesale provider. So that makes them kind of sit in the catbird seat for capital planning, financing, and the retirement and pension benefits would stay in place in terms of the city and the county. So there wouldn't be a material impact unless they're found to be some reason they had to transition. But given that it's primarily a city utility, there doesn't seem to be a reason to do that. The, again, kind of the options snapshot. So the city director of public works predominantly makes all decisions, has to run them up the flagpole of city government to get them implemented in terms of, rates and capital improvements. But they would be responsible for kind of the same set of operational decisions that, fall under them at the present time: budget, resource allocation, people retention, hiring, all of the kind of conventional things that fall under their jurisdictions. The counties would become pure wholesale customers. So as opposed to a cost sharing, it would be a wholesale rate. So predominantly on volumetric use type approach generally, but and there's usually a fixed and variable component of a wholesale rate. So you saw, fixed component covers kind of the debt service capital, the fixed cost side. A variable component could vary with particular usage. The city retains the city retail. So again, you'd have a wholesale utility, could be an authority, and you'd have the city still operating the retail side within the city and doing all the things it does now. So that would remain the same at that level. County would have the same situation. Jurisdictionally, it would have its retail rates, its retail system to operate and maintain and to finance. The one of the things that I do want to stress at this point, and I think it may come out again, is that under the wholesale option, the city's obligation, since they are driving the wholesale utility, unlike now where there's a cost sharing and the counties contribute capital, the wholesale agency would be responsible for financing all of the debt and forecasting all of the debt. So that could be a significant change in terms of now some of that is contributed or by the county. It would be paid for in a future revenue stream within the rates, but it would not be contributed as capital. So it's a different rate structure, different relationship. It actually distances perhaps the county from the interaction of the wholesale utility. So that's kind of one of the options for that. There would have to be, some establishment of some of the procedures for setting the wholesale rates, because it is a different structure and there's different ideas around cost sharing. You have to have some ability to make sure that long-term interests are protected. You certainly wouldn't want to, find that county is short on wastewater treatment services or short on water 5 or 6 years out. So there have to be provisions built into the wholesale agreements to do that and make sure that's addressed in the rate. You would certainly want, notice and transparency issues where if big policy decisions were going to be made by the city as the wholesaler, that they would engage within what amounts to the greatest amount of possible time for the counties and invite the counties to at least become aware of them so they understand, the fiscal impact or the planning impacts that those type of decisions would make. And again, there would be kind of the normal management things of recommended audited financials, maybe periodic management performance, and publish key metrics. How is the utility doing visibly? So trying to make the performance transparent. I think I'm on approach. Transition approach is fundamentally the same. There's really not a significant difference in the steps or approach. So I'm not going to go through the details of that. There would need to be this new interlocal agreement for the wholesale relationship set up. So that is substantially different than what you have in terms of the agreement between the parties. So that would take some time to negotiate. There are lots of examples out there of wholesale working relationships. And system transition and costs. Again, this slide is fundamentally the same. There's got some bookmark costs. If you choose to use minimum or choose to use the maximum amount of resources available to the parties, costs less. If you choose to, go the route of, creating a PMO and creating parties that are paid as third parties to do that, costs more. And again, we've used some bookmarks. We're going to come back and circle back to put more realistic comparative numbers as to what other people have experienced in there. And I'm going to transition to assets.
Okay. So this discussion will go quicker, partly because Neil's already covered some of it, and partly because the change in governance is much less. It's a much smaller change in governance compared with the regional authority. So asset leases, only one meaning of the phrase asset lease here, and that's the leases that the city and the county each have right now as a course of doing business, and those would be unchanged under a wholesale agreement. The responsibility for services for the most part is the same. Capital costs, the city would solely be responsible for how capital costs are determined for the wholesale assets. That is a change from how it's done now. For billing and collections, it does have an effect on billing and collections. The city would bill the county on a wholesale basis using a wholesale rate. You would have cost of service parameters that would be used to develop the wholesale rate, but it would be a wholesale rate as opposed to a specific cost allocation. The city would do its own retail customer billing for water and sewer services, and the county would do its retail billing for water and sewer services. For rate restructuring, each entity retains their rate setting policies. So that aspect of it, the how rates are developed would, or the procedure for how rates would be developed doesn't change. Debt obligations, there is one clarification to this slide. As Neil mentioned, this is a change from the current process. The current process, as Neil mentioned, is for the joint use wastewater facilities and the water supply and treatment that the county makes capital contributions up front. And so the city only bonds or only pays for its portion of those costs. It would only issue debt for its portion of the cost. The county would issue debt if it needed to for the county's portion of to fund the upfront contribution. With the wholesale arrangement, the city would be issuing all of the debt, and it would incorporate the debt repayment obligation from the county into a wholesale water rate. And for pensions, the pension plans would continue because the city, there is no change there's no formation of a new entity. So existing city employees would stay in the city's pension plan, and the county employees would be covered under the county's pension plan.
And looking to kind of wrap up, so we're moving at lightning speed on these to get through these. But again, they are a lot of the discussion is similar to what it was before. But in the wholesale, this is kind of changing the interface of what the city has on a wholesale basis now, and the relationship from the 74, 72 agreements with cost sharing to a wholesale rate basis. So that's the major change. Impact on the asset leases are, as Art said, de minimis, because they're basically going to be, retail automobile fleet type things. On the capital costs, the city would determine all of the capital costs for the wholesale assets, and the city and county retail asset capital costs would be developed and dealt with locally and built into the local rates. On billing and collections, there would be simple bills for the wholesale service from the city to the county, and the county would then use its local rate and build up its costs and bill and collect them. And there may be multiple options for doing this. The city has the system. They could continue that, or the county would have to conceivably set up its own billing system if it wanted to assume that in total.
We have a question from Mr. Cabetta.
He's asking if WSP has explored what if any modifications to the physical infrastructure would be required in the systems, for example, pipes, pump stations, etc., to accommodate option D. Any perspective from other jurisdictions looked at?
I think in honest answer to that, it was not our job to do facility assessments or capital planning studies. We have, inquired as to what's involved, but to the greatest extent, and certainly for the wholesale assets that are important to both the city and the county, we've kind of relied on the fact that there are long-term capital plans and long-term financing plans for capital and O&M already in existence. So we're unfortunately we're not into forensic accounting and forensic operational assessments. We're operating at a bit of a higher level. So we're kind of relying on what has been done.
Hold on, we got a list now.
Sure.
We got Dr. Mitchell, then we have Ms. Powell, then we have Ms. Buckler.
Thank you. Just a quick question. For this model, I think I understand how that would impact the city as far as the city setting the capital structure and recouping that debt service through a rate. How would this impact the other wholesale customer, if any? Just so I can understand that.
Well, I mean, there, as I think as Art has indicated, the county presently has what I understand to be the wholesale relationship with like Howard County for sewer, at least. So they could conceivably continue that type of a relationship or execute their own type of an agreement there for that. Since that's not a city customer, I mean, I'm there may be other possibilities. I'm just kind of thinking of what would be the logical step of that. If there is no, contractual privity between them and the city at this point, it just stands to reason that would work from that platform. But so the city would charge the county the wholesale rates that are associated with that, and the county would then collect that from their customers and forward it or pay it to the city.
I can speak to the water side too. So the water, the contractual relationships are all with the city. And right now there's a cost allocation model that separates, allocates certain O&M costs between all of the parties. And although the principles of cost allocation would remain, the change that I was describing, that Neil and I were describing for the how the capital is funded and how wholesale rates are developed with respect to the city and the county would also carry forward to the city and the other wholesale partners.
Other
Yes.
listed questions?
With respect to your the way you've laid out Model D and Model C, it's still contemplating that this would be under the Director of Public Works. Have you considered, and would there be any pros and cons to standing up a standalone or separate department for the water and sewer enterprise that would be akin to some of the models that you've looked at, like City of Atlanta, for instance, and what the implications would be? Because D and C seem to be speaking to governance agreements with essentially the same structure.
Yeah, and I mean, if I can, I've indicated that there are options within kind of the new authority. So the new authority is a very structurally different governance model. You could have a wholesale version of it, or you could have a completely vertically integrated version of the authority. So within Model E, the variants give you, I think, the option that you're looking at, which would be a wholesale utility that is a new authority governed by an entirely different group of people.
That's not what I've asked. I've asked a separate department within the city. Your Model D and C still contemplate this being a bureau in the Department of Public Works, and it doesn't speak to the authority of the bureau head. So have you looked at a structure that would create a separate, distinct department for water and wastewater in the city, akin to other models that you've looked at, like the City of Atlanta?
I can't speak to the governance of the City of Atlanta at the moment. I will be there tomorrow, though.
Okay. If you could follow up with the
yeah.
comparison there for what that structure would look like.
Could you help me kind of envision or understand what shifting from one department to another?
Within the City of Baltimore, transportation used to be a bureau within the City of Baltimore's Department of Public Works. It's now a standalone department. General Services used to be a bureau within Public Works. Water and wastewater is still a bureau within Public Works. What would the benefit and the model look like for creating a standalone water and wastewater department within the city as a model? And that would be akin to other municipally owned and operated water and wastewater utilities like the City of Atlanta, which was in your comparison list.
Yeah, I at least I understand, I think, your question. It may be kind of a variant of the intermunicipal agreement type deal. I mean, if you're just saying you're going to change from a bureau, to a different structural organization or different organization in the city, the core relationships between the city and county would probably be the same, I would think. So I'm not sure that's the case. Again, I'm not.
I think this is one of those situations where, as much as we might be tempted to try to go into the full details, I think you should say, okay, we'll do that. Yeah, I mean, and I say this in my least mansplainy way, as somebody who has their own very strong feelings about the departures of transportation and general services from the former Department of Public Works, which is now down to the Department of Sanitation and Water. Regardless of that. I don't know that it would make a huge difference on many of the things that they're looking at, but I think it is worth. I think it's worth noting that one option inside both C and D is to break water and wastewater out into their own separate. I mean, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit over the years, that it's already a separate enterprise fund, and that it's already separate in that regards, and that there's one last step you could take and actually make it its own department. The only question I would ask Ms. Powell to consider is, in the scheme of things, given that still wouldn't address the same issues of concern about how the overall governance works. Is it something that we want to make WSP spend staff time on to distinguish between two different ways of doing D and C, when I don't know that either version is going to make either option more or less attractive as an overall option?
So I would not be so quick to say that it would not necessarily change the overall governance, because I think it is a change in governance structure somewhat from what we have now. But to the questions and comments that have been received, I think it would go a long way to addressing some of the other concerns that were raised regarding compliance and workforce and potentially affordability again. And I think that is a structure that is a departure from what exists now. And because there were models in the spreadsheet that we were given that reflect that structure, then I think we should have information on what that would look like and what that would mean for the two entities.
All of which are fair points. So, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. Buckler.
We understand. We'll follow up.
I want to second some of what Ms. Powell just said. There's a lot of issues that were addressed in the New Gen report from last year, the year before. And that's part of the reason that we're here. And a lot of these are issues with the day-to-day operations. And changing to this wholesale agreement, I don't see how any of those things are addressed or reformed. Issues that we've had at Back River that Tim and I both sat there continuously on for months. How is any of that addressed? The staffing challenges, the staffing training challenges, the shortages, ordering processes, delays in procurement, delays in, all of that led to the environmental challenges that were the end result of each one of those challenges. How does a wholesale service agreement address any of those issues?
That is the subject of the next meeting. But you know, those are certainly very, very valid questions. So you know, that we have spent a fair amount of time on fiscal side matters. We will pivot and do our best in 45 minutes to capture the performance issues and how they play a role in the decision making. And I ask you to pick the mantle of that question up in the next meeting. So, where are we? We at the summary? I believe we're at the summary. We're just finishing combined debt requirements. As we indicated, that it would change the debt obligations, and the transition of pensions wouldn't be material under the wholesale as it was presented. And in the Model C, this is this is using the same fundamental relationships that exist in the 72 and 74 agreement, but looking at what changes are possible. Sorry. What changes are possible, in essence, in terms of augmenting, improving, adding things into those agreements. So at the core of it, it would be some type of reopening and refreshing that which is in the in those agreements. And so, you know, the utility policy and decision making really would still continue to be handled independently. I'm suggesting that there be more effort placed on, you know, and structurally pursued in terms of joint planning for the kind of modified intermunicipal agreement. The rate setting structure would not materially change. You'd still be in a cost basis. There would be, I think, an update of the CAM model to kind of refresh it, make sure the archaic terms are either updated or understood fully, and documentation made such that if it continues to move forward, or if there is transition in people, that there is a documented history of its use and how to use it, instructions kind of things. In terms of the capital planning, again, there would be a look at what would take to optimize that. I think that was the intent of the agreement. It may have not worked quite the way I think the authors of that agreement worked. So how to jointly plan long-term for capital planning. And financing would stay the same, and the retirement and pensions would stay the same. So again, I think as the parallel of the case, there's still a city director of public works would make the vast majority of decisions affecting the larger water assets, or what I've described as wholesale water assets in the joint use facilities on the wastewater side. The consolidation of the billing system to one platform would certainly be the advantageous, and that's currently underway, and it may be done you know, at some time in the foreseeable future, but there's still two different rate structures and billing approaches. It could be a consideration, but it's unlikely that that would be a challenge that would be taken on by, in essence, refreshing and updating the interlocal agreements. So there again could be more performance implications embedded in the agreement. I mean, one of the statements that's made in the new gen agreement is those agreements are very cost focused. They're very you know, how do you share, how do you interact with one another? But there are very few, if any, performance measures associated with the agreement. There could be incorporation of some performance agreements. So, and I think the next slide is just some of the attributes to consider for modification, since this is kind of close to where you are. So looking at some type of joint structured office for billing and customer service. A good deal of the issues, certainly that it historically existed, and while they are clearly improving, still may exist to some extent, relate to the customer-facing activities in the city and the county, and the relationship between the two groups, two entities, to work through those. Certainly as a utility, I think you want your customer-facing activities, your interactions with the community to be top flight. So getting that worked out in this agreement, if you were to choose this, would be, an imperative. So again, kind of looking at some of the tools that may be available to make sure that what is decided on, what is performed, is tracked, and there is benchmarks to look at organizational change performance. So performance management audits, again, key performance indicators. If there is performance measures, show what they are, make them transparent. And again, joint review the CAM model. And I think, as has already been discussed, greater emphasis on tracking and make sure that, some of the things that we as a consultant look at as revenue enhancement, but they are making sure everybody on the that's in the customer accounts is paying their fair and equitable share. So you want a high degree of certainty. I think, as the senator indicated, that everybody's paying what they should be charged, and that everybody's getting that fairly. So that there are measures that can be done. Yes.
We have a question from Dr. Mitchell and then Ms. Buckman.
Sure.
Just a quick question for this, and I don't see in the slides where it talks about governance. I know in example, I think E, the potential of it transition could have either very small or very large costs associated with it. For this example, from a governance standpoint, could the city, county, or even the other wholesale customers create an agreement under this model to look at how they govern or make decisions for the utility? Is that a possibility under this model? If that does that make sense?
Yeah, and certainly I think we've mentioned one aspect of it. How do you jointly plan long term and resolve issues between the performance of the city system and the county system in the interdependence? So I think you're alluding to more than that.
Yeah, like a board that would look at that, that could be appointed by those agencies to make decisions similar, but probably with different authority than you would have in E. I'm just asking the question because finances will be critical in those decisions, right?
I'm gonna say you stumped me. I have to think about that, to be honest, because I'm not sure if you change. Representative Powell, she was talking about if you change it to a different structure within the city, that's to some extent seemingly analogous to that. I don't, and if you have something that's autonomous, if you get to a board that's autonomous, so free of kind of the chain of command of city affairs, then it's basically an authority. It's a new constituted authority. So that's kind of where the line seems to be drawn.
That's if they make decisions on the utility, but if they make recommendations, it wouldn't constitute an authority.
Yeah, one of the things that we haven't presented, and again, it's kind of formulated, is you can have advisory groups that do that, but they have limited authority. They simply represent the interests of the advisory group, and they can, they are in there to solely advise. We don't like what you're doing. We like what you're doing. We think you could consider that. I'm not sure.
I think we can just say flatly that there's a distinction between advice and governance.
Right.
So, Ms. Buckler.
I do want to point out, you didn't mention this specifically, but the slide says structure like the water analyzer office. So I don't want to highlight that as a point that we should emulate going forward, because it's not working. It's not staffed. It's been staffed solely by the county for an exceedingly long period of time, despite letters back and forth to the city to ask them to assist in supporting this, despite it being on monthly meetings between us and the city. It is still not staffed. So, and it is hard to fill positions. I get it. But there's no teeth in it. There's nothing in the current agreement that forces it to happen. But without that support staff, the system wouldn't function. It just wouldn't. There's so many things that office is doing and providing information on for decision making.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to add this comment. I'm sorry that I'm just getting this note now, but apparently our agreement with the church was that they would be able to lock up and go home themselves when we were done at 9 o'clock. So we have been asked to wrap this up as expeditiously as possible. If we could hurry through the substantive part of the remaining slides.
Yeah, the transition approach is fundamentally the same. So I'm not going to belabor that point anymore. Transition costs are, again, it's the same kind of docket of things. This would probably be on the lower end of time and money. But again, the money, we're going to look at what the money is likely to be.
A lot of the other considerations are only going to change to the extent you make changes to the intergovernmental agreements. So asset leases, nothing would cause intrinsically a change in how you lease assets. Same with capital costs. If you change the intergovernmental agreements, you can change how capital costs are determined. Billing and collections, and in the absence of changing the agreements to do something different, as Neil had suggested, this is the status quo. Rate restructuring, everybody retains their rate setting policies. The debt obligations, again, everybody retains their debt responsibilities for who issues debt and how it's issued, and employees would continue under their existing pension plans.
And in conclusion, there's I believe a similar slide, if I can get it called up correctly, that summarizes what some of the impacts in terms of the costs are as this alternative. And as you can see, I think Art summed it up well. The impacts of costs are only of those things that you choose and elect to change in the interlocal agreements. So there is not likely to be a great deal of financial costs. However, there could be costs to address requirements to fully staff, different joint agencies and things. So it's not without any impact, but it is not. It is the least material change of costs in any of the options. And I thank you for that fire hose.
Thank you. I also want to thank all the members of the public who have joined us here tonight. I want to thank the task force members for continuing the productive and responsible discussion as we inch forward towards an achievement of our task. The last meeting of this year will be Thursday, November 16th. So 2 weeks from tomorrow. That meeting will be virtual, and the information for logging in will be on both the city and county's sites. Again, Google Regional Water Governance Task Force. Thursday, November 16th at 6 p.m. Thank you all very much. And please, you don't have to go home, but we encourage you not to linger if your lingering interferes with the people who are trying to break down and clean up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.